I get a phone call from my daughter saying, "Dad, I have something serious to tell you."
The person is already in a coma, so there is no more suffering when he's beaten.
Personally, I didn't know that he went to those kinds of places.
Why did he end up going down that street?
You think maybe it's someone who came to the store often, who we knew?
We know where you live, and we're going to kill your children.
It still sends a shiver down my spine.
On Saturday, August 6, 2011, the Annemasse police receives an anonymous call saying that an injured man is lying on the street.
I notice after a few compressions that under his left eye, on his cheekbone, blood trickles out every time I press on his torso. That's when I realize this person has been shot.
The victim's name is Gregory Mercier. He was an apparently normal 34-year-old man.
One moment you have a son, and then suddenly you find out that he's been murdered. You ask yourself, why him?
The murder was extremely violent.
The barrel of the gun was put in his mouth, so they really wanted to kill him, and in a dramatic way.
To try to solve this case, the police follow many leads.
Several doors are opened which shed light on the victim, his personality, and his social circle.
Did Gregory Mercier know his killer?
In the majority of murder cases, the perpetrator and the victim know each other.
Personally, I always thought it was someone who knew him.
The police focus on the victim's love life.
The investigators look into the possibility that it was a former partner or lover.
Was Gregory Mercier in the wrong place at the wrong time?
He was homosexual. Some crazy homophobe attacked him. It's a possibility.
Could the profession of Gregory Mercier's father have led to the murder?
It could be related to me in the end. I'm a police officer. Haven't I had violent altercations in the past?
The lack of testimonies hinders the investigation.
How is it possible that this abominable thing happened and no one saw or heard anything?
But an anonymous tip-off revives the investigation.
It was a very serious allegation because it was corroborated.
Jean-Marc Bloch, former head of the Versailles Police Department, and Negar Haeri, criminal lawyer, will join us as we look back on this unsolved case. On August 6, 2011, at 11:30 p.m., an Annemasse anti-crime squad rushes to rescue a victim lying in the street. A man who refused to give his identity was the one who called the police.
Saying, there's a body lying in the street. I don't know if he's alive or dead. That's all. He didn't give his name.
2 minutes later, the same individual phoned the emergency services to again ask for help.
On this day, it's raining hard. I'm the one driving the ambulance, and we're on our way to an unconscious person, without further details. When we arrive, 2 plainclothes policemen are on the scene, who guide us with their torches, since it's a small street, not far from an intersection.
It's a dark night in this deserted place with no streetlights. Illuminated by headlights, the paramedics discover a man lying face down on the ground near a car.
I talk to him. He doesn't answer. Following the procedure, I turn him over. I tilt his head to listen and check if he's breathing. I realize he isn't breathing, and he doesn't have a pulse either. So I alert my manager to start resuscitation, CPR.
But the incessant rain obstructs the operation.
We set up a tarp. At first, we held it up ourselves to shield the victim and our colleagues who were performing CPR. Then we tried to hold it up using stakes.
While performing CPR, the paramedic makes a terrible realization.
I notice after a few compressions that under his left eye, on his cheekbone, blood trickles out every time I press on his torso. With each compression, blood flows out quickly. I realize quickly, and I tell my boss, I think this person has been shot.
The resuscitation attempts are in vain. The victim is pronounced dead. With no gun found near the body, the possibility of suicide seems highly unlikely.
From a forensic medicine perspective, everything points to this person being the victim of homicide.
Without a doubt, this death was the result of foul play. The officers informed the Annemasse Police Department. A quick examination of the body shows that the victim was shot in the face. The young man was also violently beaten.
The face is swollen. There are significant bruises, hematomas, and contusions, both from impact and abrasion. So the person was beaten while he was alive.
While the crime scene investigation begins, the Haute-Savoie Fire Department receives another anonymous call at 12:17 a.m. This time, the caller asks if the victim has been saved. The police officers haven't found identity documents on the victim. But thanks to the vehicle's license plate, they identify the owner of the car. It's Gregory Mercier, a 34-year-old man who lives in Annemasse. Given the seriousness of the incident, investigators from the Annecy Police Department are sent in as reinforcement.
When the police arrived, the rain stopped. But it was raining a lot before, which can dilute any traces of blood. This can change the preliminary findings and make them more difficult. Adequate lighting was quickly brought to the scene.
Under the spotlight, the investigators start inspecting the crime scene. The body was discovered in the town of Étrembières, 0.6 miles from Annemasse, on a small road next to the highway, but far from any houses. The Swiss border is about 200 yards away as the crow flies.
They find a closed car. The body is not inside the car. It's next to it.
The car is at the center of the preliminary investigations. A cartridge case is found on the floor on the passenger side. This is a valuable clue that will provide information about the gun that was used.
The type of gun is determined according to the ammunition that is found. In this instance, inside the car, a cartridge case is found. A cartridge case is the part that contains the powder, with the bullet affixed at the end. The experts determine it's from a .32 automatic Colt pistol.
In other words, a small caliber gun.
The location of the cartridge case inside the vehicle makes it possible to determine that when the shot was fired, the gun was inside the passenger compartment. Otherwise, the cartridge case would have been ejected outside the car.
This also proves that the victim was in the car at the time of the shooting.
It turns out that there are also traces of blood on the front seats, especially on the driver's seat.
On the front seat, the police discover a blood-stained sweater. There's also a pack of cigarettes and a butt in the ashtray. In the trunk, they find nothing that can help the investigation. DNA samples are taken. They're sent for analysis. However, no fingerprints are detected. The sweater is sealed inside a brown paper envelope. The cartridge case is immediately sent to the laboratory to find out the exact model of the murder weapon. The investigators take a print of the victim's left index finger and immediately send it for comparison with the National Fingerprint Database. They then decide to transport the body to the Annemasse morgue. But first, they must protect the victim's hands.
The evidence on the hands is protected in a typical way. It involves putting the hands in brown paper bags, sealing the bag at the wrists, then transporting the body to the autopsy room or morgue, where samples can be taken calmly in good lighting. protected from the weather, out of the rain, and so on.
At 4:45 a.m., it starts to rain again. The investigators decide to move the car found near the body to a garage.
A decision is quickly made to close it and move it, since it isn't practical to make the findings at the site of discovery. It's preferable to put it in a dry, sheltered place so that it can be searched and the necessary samples can be taken.
Then the officers from the Annecy PD learn that the anonymous calls to the emergency services were made from 2 public phone booths.
3 anonymous calls were made. 2 from a payphone in Gaillard, a town close to S03E03, where the incident took place. And then a 3rd call was made from a payphone in Ambilly,
a town 1.9 miles from the crime scene. Forensic experts are sent there.
The investigators take samples from the handset as well as the keys 1, 7, and 8. Since the person who made the anonymous calls dialed the police on 1-7 and the fire department on 1-8. They take all these samples to try to find DNA in the phone booths.
Forensic investigations were carried out to find out who made these calls. Unfortunately, the investigations have not, for the moment, been able to identify the caller.
The day after the murder, police officers return to the crime scene. They search the area, but no new evidence is discovered. Jean-Marc, the behavior of the man who made the 3 phone calls is intriguing. Not only did he take the trouble to alert the police, then the fire department, but also, during the last phone call, he tried to find out if the victim was being looked after by the emergency services, and all the while remaining anonymous. Do you think this man had anything to do with the murder?
There are 2 possibilities. Either this man witnessed the homicide, or he himself is the perpetrator of the homicide. In some cases, the murderer calls for help after carrying out the fatal act. But here, in our case, it would surprise me if the killer inquired about his victim's health after shooting him in the head. No, I think the man who made these phone calls is a witness to the crime, perhaps even an eyewitness.
Why do you think this man didn't want to be identified?
There are several possibilities. Either he's afraid of repercussions, he doesn't want his presence in the area to be known, or he could even have a criminal record and fear that the police would try to implicate him in the murder. In any case, this man has extremely important information, and it's a great shame that he hasn't been identified.
As we've seen, the crime scene was very difficult for the police to inspect. When they arrived on the scene, it was a dark night. It was raining a lot. Collecting clues was tricky. This case seems to be off to a complicated start.
Yes, it's one of the worst setups. An outdoor crime scene is always complex. It's difficult to define the perimeter. Added to this is the fact that it's dark. There's no lighting and it's raining, so things must move quickly. In general, the preliminary findings can last for hours, ending with the inspection of the victim's body.
In our case, the body is quickly taken to the morgue for shelter. Before being moved, the victim's hands are protected by paper envelopes. Jean-Marc, why this precaution?
In some cases, evidence can be found on the victim's hands, in particular DNA, which could identify the perpetrator. That's why it's necessary to protect the hands until the autopsy begins, so that the medical examiner can take samples, especially from under the victim's fingernails.
The initial findings suggest that the victim was shot in the head while sitting on the driver's side of the vehicle. We also know that he was hit several times in the face. This is a crime of unusual violence. What can you tell us about this modus operandi?
It looks like a settling of scores, but to be able to prove or disprove this theory, it will be necessary to look into the victim's lifestyle, habits, and relationships at this point in the investigation. As usual, we must beware of appearances.
The day after the discovery of the body, the police start looking for clues in the car found at the crime scene. They want to know more about the sequence of events. The forensic police go over the victim's car with a fine-tooth comb. The car body is intact. The crime, therefore, didn't take place as a result of a collision with another vehicle. Inside the passenger compartment, there are no signs of a struggle. The keys are in the ignition. But while the experts prepare to inspect the vehicle, the police receive crucial information. Thanks to the National Fingerprint Database, they have identified the victim. He was Gregory Mercier, the owner of the Renault 5. Age 34, this young man lived in Annemasse. Two investigators are immediately tasked with notifying the family. They go to the victim's address. It's his mother who opens the door. She learns of her son's tragic death and immediately informs Gregory's younger sister.
It was my mother who called me. I was at home making food for my daughter, who was 7 months old. I heard her voice trembling on the phone. She told me, "Gregory is dead."
Devastated, Delphine Mercier rushes to her mother's home.
At the time, I didn't know what had happened, so I had to go to my mom's to find out. I saw the police, who were still there. They told me my brother was murdered. Okay, I asked, "Can we see him?" "No, he's in Grenoble for the autopsy." "All right, okay." It was so shocking that I didn't even manage to cry that day. I was blank.
Gregory's sister then has the difficult task of breaking the news to her father, who's been living in Brittany since separating from his wife.
I received a phone call from my daughter telling me that my son was dead. It was really a shock, an internal shock. Then after, I said to myself, you have to get up. You have to go. You have to find out what happened.
Gregory Mercier's family informs the young man's friends.
Yes, I was devastated. I didn't believe it, and I didn't want to believe it, and especially so violently. The world stopped turning that day.
As the news of Gregory Mercier's death spreads, the police continue their inspection of the victim's car. They discover a crushed bullet tip in the front passenger seat. Behind, samples of 2 metal fragments are taken. Everything points to this being the bullet that struck the victim in his left cheekbone.
We can easily imagine this bullet entering the cheekbone and coming back out into the vehicle. It will be found either at the front if the shot was high, or in the back of the vehicle if the shot was low.
The ballistics expert can now determine the killer's likely position when the gun was fired.
The victim, who was in a sitting position in the vehicle, was shot horizontally and slightly downwards. This fits with the shooter standing outside the car, placing the barrel of the gun inside the passenger compartment and shooting the seated victim. So the shot was fired slightly downwards and from left to right.
Only the autopsy will make it possible to prove or disprove these first deductions. The seat covers are collected as evidence, along with a pack of cigarettes and a cigarette butt. No other clues are discovered. The crime scene investigation has been completed and the victim's identity is now known. The character investigation can now begin. The priority is to find out as soon as possible who this young man was. For Gregory Mercier's loved ones, the murder is incomprehensible.
You break down. One moment, you have a son. And then suddenly you find out he's been murdered. You ask yourself, why him? He had a zest for life, and he was so kind, so nice, and always happy to help. I didn't understand. It was a real shock.
The police want to know why Gregory Mercier's fingerprints were registered in the National Fingerprint Database.
He is registered in a police database because at one point he was questioned in the context of legal proceedings.
Gregory Mercier had been involved in a case because he was accused of a criminal offense by his former employer. So he was known to the police. That's overstating it. But he was put on file as part of that case.
Grief-stricken by Gregory's murder, the Mercier family must also face a series of newspaper articles that paint an unflattering portrait of the young man.
After his murder, every day there was an article in the press talking about his criminal record not being clean, which is totally false. They talked about the case from when he worked at a casino. He was accused of stealing cash. It was proven that it wasn't him. So he didn't have a criminal record. When we see this, we think, what's that got to do with it? He's a victim, and they're tarnishing his memory.
It was like he was a criminal, and he deserved what happened to him. I couldn't stand that.
Gregory Mercier's father, a former police officer on the En Masse Anti-Crime Squad, wants to set the record straight.
Gregory was compensated. He was paid about 9,600 euros at the time, as compensation for the crime he didn't commit. There you go.
He was an ordinary young man. I know that when the case was covered in the press, they indicated in a clumsy and inappropriate way that he had a criminal record. That's not true. This is someone with no criminal history and a clean criminal record.
The investigators try to paint a portrait of the victim. Born in Lorient in 1977, Gregory Mercier was single and lived with his mother in En Masse. He had worked for 3 years in the books and stationery department of a downtown store.
Since he was a kid, he had no problems. He never raised his voice. He was a quiet child. He was nice, smiley, and often gullible too, because he believed everything he was told.
Cheerful, always helpful. He was kind. He was someone who was very smiley. He was always smiling. He was really nice. He was a very nice person. He liked to talk about lots of topics. He was really nice.
Close to his family, Gregory Mercier was nevertheless very discreet about his private life.
I was one of the first people he came out to. Everyone suspected it, but he admitted it to me. I had a party for my 18th birthday, and he told me, I'm gay. I said, listen, that doesn't change anything for me. You're my brother, so I don't care. It's fine, don't worry.
On a vacation in 2006, at the beach, he told me on the towel, Dad, I have something to tell you. It's pretty heavy. I said, what is it? Well, I'm gay. I told him, son, I've known that for some time already. And then I said, it's your life. I have nothing to reproach you for. You're my son. I don't see why I would reproach you for that. This is your life. You decide.
We had the opportunity to meet his partner at the time who came to the house. We spent Christmas together.
Gregory Mercier moved back in with his mother after breaking up with his partner. Since then, the young man had been looking for a new love. He planned to start all over again elsewhere, in Brittany, near his father in a region he loved.
Gregory was particularly fond of Celtic culture because it reminded him of his happy childhood. He loved that culture and the wild side over there. It was free and understated. I think Brittany appealed to him.
The police continued their investigation into the life of Gregory Mercier. While questioning his loved ones, they learned that the young man was HIV positive.
In the family, I was the first one he told about his HIV status.
I think he was someone who had the strength to remain cheerful in the face of adversity.
At the time of his death, Gregory had many plans, including realizing one of his biggest dreams.
Gregory and I had a shared passion for Brazil because he had studied Portuguese in middle school and high school. He wanted to discover that country. We promised each other that we would visit that beautiful country, where I've already been, but it has my heart. It was important to me to show him around and help him discover all these wonderful places, and unfortunately, he didn't go.
The character investigation doesn't offer an explanation for the murder.
He was an unproblematic man, described as nice and likable by the people who knew him. He was kind. He was just an ordinary young man.
Nagar, we learned that Gregory Mercier was accused of theft by his former employer before his name was completely cleared. Why were the fingerprints of this young man with a clean criminal record still on file?
When a person is implicated in legal proceedings, they must, during police custody, give their fingerprints so they can be recorded in the national database. Today, the law decrees that any data related to people who have been cleared should be erased, but at the time of the events, these provisions did not yet exist. That's undoubtedly why the fingerprints and the information relating to Gregory Mercier remained in the database, even though the theft he was accused of had not been proven and he had been cleared.
We heard Gregory Mercier's loved ones' outrage at the press articles that said the young man had a criminal record. Could they sue the newspapers that published this false information?
I know that Noël Mercier filed a complaint against the newspapers, but this complaint was unsuccessful. A law of July 29, 1881, defines the freedoms and responsibilities of the French press and gives a legal framework to publications. Article 34 sets out a fine, which varies according to the nature of the remarks, to punish writers who defame or insult the memory of the dead. But the problem is, as well as the offense against the memory of the dead, the perpetrator must also have intended to damage the beneficiaries' reputations. If this additional condition is not reported, which is often the case, the beneficiaries will have to make do with a right to reply, defined in Article 13 of this law, without punishment by a fine.
After the character investigation, the police now try to retrace Gregory Mercier's last day. They discover that on Saturday, August 6, 2011, like every week, the young man worked at the book and stationery store where he had been an employee for several years. They also learned that he left the store at 7 p.m. after a completely normal day without any noteworthy incidents.
That evening for me, he was his usual self, smiling and cheerful. It was the weekend, so he was happy. We were going to see each other again on Monday. Everything was totally normal.
After work, Gregory Mercier went straight to his mother's small apartment on the 3rd floor of the Perrier building in Annemasse.
My mother didn't notice anything strange about Gregory. He didn't look stressed or different from usual.
Gregory had a quick dinner with his mother, then went to his room while waiting to go out to meet his friend Julie.
We had arranged to go out on Saturday night. I had recently got into a relationship with my current partner, and I just wanted to introduce him to Greg. We were planning to meet at a bar-restaurant in Annemasse.
While waiting to meet up with Julie, Gregory browsed dating sites. Around 10:30 p.m., the young man left for the night out. His mother told Gregory's sister that he had his satchel slung over his shoulder as usual.
When he left my mother's house, he had this satchel with his usual belongings inside. His phone, his wallet, his meal tickets, everything.
Gregory got in his car to meet his friend at the bar restaurant. They were planning to go to a nightclub later.
He went to get gas not very far from the crime scene in Gaillard, next to the supermarket.
His bank statements proved that he paid for the gas at 10:42 p.m. in Gaillard, a small town very close to the crime scene. But at that time, no employees were at the gas station. In the absence of witnesses and CCTV cameras, it's impossible to say if the young man was still alone. Julie was surprised that Gregory had not yet arrived at the bar where they were going to meet.
I thought something had delayed him, but he was just running late and he must be on his way.
At 11:03, Julie finally received a message.
I received a text message from Greg saying, "Where are you and what are we doing?"
At 11:11, the young woman texted him back.
I answered, "Let's get moving." We knew the nightclub wasn't next to his home. So we waited and waited, and then nothing.
Julie knew Gregory wasn't in the habit of showing up late.
If we planned to meet up, he came. He came, period. If someone was running late, it was me, not him.
The young woman was getting impatient.
At 12:43, I tried to call him twice, and I got a voicemail message in German, which wasn't his usual voicemail message. I thought it was weird. He must be in Switzerland or nearby. Generally, when your cell phone automatically switches to a Swiss-German voicemail, it's because the phone has crossed the border or is in an area very close to the border. So I thought it was strange because it looked like the phone had moved away from our meeting place.
Tired of waiting, Julie then went to a nightclub with her partner.
Then we left because he should have arrived almost an hour and a half earlier. We thought it was weird. We didn't consider the worst-case scenario, but we said the word weird several times.
It was only the next day that Julie learned why Gregory did not come to meet her.
I found out about his death early the next morning from Delphine, his sister, who called my parents' house where I was. She told me the news that Greg had been found murdered, apparently shot in the head. I didn't understand it right away. Honestly, I think anyone who learns such news can't believe it, at least for the first few minutes.
The investigators then study Gregory Mercier's phone records. They want to know when the young man arrived at the crime scene. Tracking his cell phone makes it possible to retrace his last steps. At 11:03, when Gregory sent a message to his friend Julie, his phone was at the place where his body was later found. When his friend answered him at 11:11, Gregory's cell phone was still in the same place.
You might wonder, knowing that he was meeting his best friend and had left home at 10:30, what was he up to in the meantime? Why did he end up in that state on that street?
The police learned that at 11:33, although the emergency services had already been notified of the attack on Gregory Mercier, the young man's phone was in Arsham, a small town 6 miles from the crime scene, close to the Swiss border. They also learned that his phone was used until 11:47. The person who had it surfed the internet, connecting to Google and Facebook. Then the phone was permanently turned off. Almost an hour later, his friend Julie's calls were met by a German-language voicemail service.
There's no technical certainty about what this voicemail service means. It could be that the phone was taken by the killer or by a third party. This third party went abroad and triggered the operators of a third country. The closest is the German-speaking part of Switzerland.
The victim's cell phone has never been found, nor have his ID cards, meal tickets, or the keys to his mother's apartment. He always kept these items on him. In the satchel, he never went anywhere without. Gregory Mercier sent his last text message to his friend Julie at 11:03 p.m. GPS tracking of his cell phone proves that he was then at the scene of the crime. His phone was then tracked from 11:33, 6 miles away, here in the town of Arsham, even though the murder had already been committed by that time. What do you deduce from this, Jean-Marc?
I deduce two things from this. The first is that at 11:03, Gregory did not feel threatened. He was free to move around since he was texting his friend Julie about their plans that evening. The second thing I deduce is that his murder took place very quickly, since at 11:33, the phone was here, 6 miles from the crime scene.
Do you think the killer was the one who took Gregory Mercier's phone?
In general, a murderer doesn't bother taking items from the victim that could be incriminating, especially a cell phone, which everyone knows is easy to track. But in our case, I think it was the killer who took the phone, not to keep it, but to do research and check that this phone did not contain anything that could incriminate them. That's why they browsed Facebook. This leads me to the following conclusion. There is a connection between the perpetrator and the victim.
Does this mean that Gregory Mercier was planning to meet his killer that night?
I don't know about that. All I can tell you is that it wasn't by chance that he ended up on that small street, far away from houses, but not deserted. Remember that evening, on that street, there were at least 3 people. Gregory Mercier, his killer, and the witness who called for help at 11:30.
The investigation needs to establish why Gregory Mercier went to this small street in Étrembières instead of meeting his friend. In the meantime, the investigators hope that the autopsy will give them a better understanding of the circumstances of the murder. On August 7, 2011, a CT scan of Gregory Mercier's body is performed at Grenoble University Hospital's Forensic Institute.
Before the autopsy, the body is put in a closed and airtight cover into a scanner. Pictures of the entire body are taken and then pieced together in the form of 3-dimensional imaging. This provides evidence in terms of ballistics.
The next morning at 9 a.m., the body enters the autopsy room. Swabs are used to take samples from the victim's hands.
No gunpowder residue is found on the victim's hands, which means first that he wasn't the one who fired the gun, clearly. And moreover, he didn't try to defend himself.
The medical examiner then carries out the external examination of the body and discovers abrasions on the victim's skin.
Abrasions occur when the skin has been scratched or rubbed. So this suggests that the body may have been dragged across a rough surface, extracted from the vehicle, and pulled for a few yards.
Noting a very significant hematoma on the right side of his head, the medical examiner concludes that Gregory Mercier was hit with a blunt object, such as a baseball bat.
The lesions on the body reflect blows that were delivered while the person was still alive, which is not to say that he was fully conscious.
The forensic pathologist continues his examination. He focuses on the bullet entrance wound in the victim's left cheekbone.
This shot caused significant damage. So there was almost a brain death, or at least death throes.
The forensic findings make it possible to outline the sequence of events. The killer allegedly shot the victim before taking him out of the car to beat him.
The person is already in a coma, so there is fortunately no more suffering when he's beaten. In any case, no awareness of what is happening to him.
Gregory Mercier is buried 7 days after his murder on August 13, 2011. But 2 months later, there's a turn of events. The examining magistrate orders the exhumation of the body. The magistrate has just learned that a computer failure prevented the medical examiner from reading the scans made during the autopsy. It seems that a bullet escaped the examiner's attention. A new forensic examination is ordered because it's imperative to extract this bullet from the victim's body.
It's brutal for the family and the loved ones, but necessary. It's impossible to let go of a piece of evidence like that. A bullet still inside the body can't be overlooked.
And that's when we were summoned for an exhumation, a second burial, as if we needed that.
It was a second ordeal. It was more sorrow. We didn't understand. We thought, what are we being asked to do here? We're being asked to go through a second funeral? We couldn't understand it.
Dismayed by this new ordeal, Noël Mercier decides to take photos.
We wanted to inform people, and Gregory's friends. We wanted to show them what the French authorities were capable of doing to victims. And for us, it was very shocking.
Nagar, we've just heard about Noël Mercier's anger when he learned his son's body was going to be exhumed. Could the family have objected to this exhumation?
No, the reason Gregory Mercier's body was exhumed was for the autopsy and to try to understand the circumstances of his death. It was an investigative measure that the examining magistrate ordered to establish the truth, so no one, not even the family, could object.
Gregory Mercier's father attended the exhumation. Was his presence mandatory?
No. In fact, there are no rules about this. The question we must ask is if the presence of the plaintiff during an investigative measure could help establish the truth. If so, as in the case with confrontations or reconstructions, their presence is mandatory, otherwise it isn't. So if Noël Mercier's presence at the exhumation of his son's body for the upcoming autopsy had no bearing on the investigation, his presence wasn't mandatory.
A judicial investigation has been opened for murder. As we've seen, this was a particularly violent murder. Given the seriousness of the crime, could the prosecutor have opened a judicial investigation not just for murder, but for murder with aggravating factors?
From a legal perspective, the point of specifying an aggravating factor is to get an idea about the eventual penalty. We know that an aggravating factor increases the initial sentence. Since murder already incurs the maximum penalty according to the law, that is to say life in prison, aggravating factors are not set out. But we must distinguish the legal aspect from the practical aspect, because the terrible circumstances in which a murder is committed will obviously be taken into consideration by the court when determining the number of years in prison actually imposed.
After the exhumation of Gregory Mercier's body, the second autopsy takes place, guided this time by the CT imaging. The medical examiner extracts another bullet from the victim's second cervical vertebra. It has now been established that Gregory Mercier was killed not by one bullet, but by two.
They really wanted to kill him, and in a dramatic way. As for the second shot, the most likely entrance wound is through the mouth, which means that the barrel of the gun was put in the person's mouth.
This latest piece of information is chilling. Gregory was the victim of a cold execution, perhaps while he was dying on the ground near his car. The ballistics experts must now determine the exact model of the murder weapon. By analyzing the bullets, they conclude that it was a semi-automatic pistol, an FN model 1910.
For someone who knows how an automatic pistol works, it's simple. Since the only things to do from the moment the magazine is loaded are to pull the slide to the rear to arm the mechanism and then pull the trigger to fire. So it's an easy weapon to use for someone who knows a little bit about guns. It is not a very complicated weapon to use.
This Belgian gun was used during World War II, then by the French police forces between 1945 and 1970.
Many retired police officers took their guns with them, so there are quite a lot of these weapons in circulation. As a result, they are still found in criminal cases to this day.
Jean-Marc, we just heard the ballistics experts say that there are many FN model 1910 guns in circulation because police officers often kept their service weapons when they retired. This explanation may seem rather surprising.
Yes, it's true. We were much less rigorous back then than today. A number of retiring police officers declared the loss, theft, or disappearance of their service weapon. It's true, we end up becoming attached to the symbolic object that we carried for 40 years. It's hard to part with it. But the problem is that when the owner died, nobody really knew what became of the gun. And sometimes it ended up in the arms trade, being bought by a collector. I would like to add that several tens of thousands of models of this gun were manufactured, and it was not intended only for law enforcement agencies.
We now know that Gregory Mercier was shot with 2 bullets, one in the left cheekbone at close range and another inside the mouth. Gregory Mercier was also violently beaten with a blunt object, such as a baseball bat. During your career, Jean-Marc, did you ever work on a murder with such a brutal modus operandi?
I have seen people who were beaten, tortured, and then killed. But someone being shot in the head, hit with a blunt object like a baseball bat, and then finished off with a bullet in the mouth? That I've never seen. I must admit this is a first.
What can we deduce from this MO?
For some unknown reason, it indicates a very strong hatred from the perpetrator towards the victim. Is this hatred due to something that the victim did or didn't do? Is this hatred due to something that the victim heard or saw? Is this hatred due simply to the victim's personality? The investigation has to establish this because each trail is very different.
We also learned that Gregory Mercier had no traces of gunpowder on his hands, which means that he did not reflexively protect himself, so the attack was extremely sudden.
Sudden and unpredictable, too. It suggests that there was no verbal or physical altercation before the first shot. Whatever the reason why Gregory Mercier was in that place, he didn't suspect anything. He felt safe. He didn't go there to settle a conflict.
The police now know that the killer was determined. They decide to return to the crime scene. What was Gregory Mercier doing on that small street on the night of the murder? Was he meeting someone? Who frequents this place? The investigators make every effort to answer these questions as soon as possible. This place is known as a rough area because it's a no-man's land between a river, a quarry, and a highway. The investigators learn that it's a hookup spot visited by many local men.
It's a meeting place for homosexuals, but also people in heterosexual marriages who want to meet homosexuals.
It's a place for furtive encounters.
A place frequented by people who prefer to remain anonymous.
A lot of people drive there, looking for someone. They circle around 3, 4, or 5 times, and sometimes they stop. They get out of the car, they wait. They look for an encounter like that.
Gregory's family was completely unaware that the young man visited this place.
He didn't tell us about it at all.
We knew he visited gay dating sites like even straight people do. We also knew he went to saunas, places that were a little more monitored and less seedy. But personally, I didn't know at all that he went to those kinds of places.
Why go to those places? Why go to such risky places where you could be attacked or be in danger?
Is it possible that Gregory was killed while trying to have an encounter?
I don't think he realized the danger it could put him in. From there to getting murdered. Maybe getting your face smashed in, that's not as serious. But the possibility of getting murdered, I don't think he realized that.
He was homosexual. Some crazy homophobe attacked him. It's a possibility.
There was a time when young people from en masse hung out saying, "Let's beat up a faggot. I've seen it before."
What could motivate a homophobic murder?
Being homophobic means hating homosexuality. It's extremely simple. The psychological motive for this hatred is the rejection of the feminine part that a man has in himself, or the masculine part that a woman has in herself.
In that case, what would the killer's motive be?
He kills to get rid of the object of his desire, and in a brutal way, because it puts him in a state of terrible anger, but against himself, more than against the person, against his own desire that he spurns.
The investigators discover that the men who visit the meeting place are particularly afraid of the customers of a paintball club located next door.
There was a time when the paintballers were pretty aggressive towards us. They drove quickly and violently down the road where we were parked. Sometimes they even came straight at us, hit the brakes, and then left. There were even some who came by with airsoft guns and shot at us.
On the night of the murder, there was a birthday party at the paintball center with about 20 guests.
They were mostly indoors. No one saw or heard anything.
Of course, there must have been music, but still, I think a gunshot isn't insignificant. It can be heard.
The police question each of the guests, but don't get any information.
How is it possible that this abominable thing happened and no one saw or heard anything?
Subsequently, the managers of this establishment are questioned several times to clarify things about the people who go to their establishment. And there's no reason to suspect anyone who attended that party of being directly or indirectly involved in the murder of Gregory Mercier.
The investigators then collect the testimony of a man who frequents the meeting place in S03E03. He says that a year before the murder of Gregory Mercier, he was threatened by an individual in a car, armed with a rifle. He adds that he was on the street where Gregory Mercier was killed. The witness gives a precise description of the vehicle in which the armed man was parked. It was a small yellow utility vehicle that looked like a post office car. The police officers immediately remember coming across a similar vehicle on the night of Gregory Mercier's murder. At the time, they checked the driver's identity, who was passing the crime scene and seemed to be watching the investigators. On August 31st, 2011, 4 weeks after the murder of Gregory Mercier, the suspect is taken into custody.
The investigators made the connection right away. This individual behaved very strangely, and it would be a good idea to question him and find out what he was doing at the time of the incident.
This 47-year-old man is questioned about his presence near the crime scene on the night of the incident.
He was an insomniac, so he often left home at night, and he went around all the meeting points.
The man is married with children. He says he's not homosexual and regularly comes to the meeting place out of simple curiosity.
I would describe this individual in custody as someone who is strongly attracted to homosexuality, which pushes him to see homosexuals. But he also completely represses this desire to see homosexuals. He's confused.
The suspect denies any involvement in the murder of Gregory Mercier. His home and his vehicle are searched. No weapon is found. No material evidence which could incriminate him is discovered. After 9.5 hours of interrogation, the police custody ends. The man is in the clear. The police continue their investigations. They're surprised that no witnesses have come forward, even though they know the meeting place was visited every evening by dozens of people.
Needless to say, if you have homosexual urges that you want to satisfy, even if you are married and you don't want anyone to find out, then you don't risk answering calls for witnesses. This complicates the investigations, of course.
Obviously, there are people who were present or witnessed what happened, and these people have never spoken out.
They want to keep it a secret. It's their secret garden. It's understandable.
There's a fear of being identified or recognized by someone, especially by the police. Always with this issue of guilt.
Between social consciousness and protecting their private lives, people generally choose privacy and peace. It's an obvious choice. We see it all the time.
Jean-Marc, the investigators now know why Gregory Mercier ended up on the night of the crime on the small street in S03E03. This place is a meeting point that he apparently used to frequent. Do you think, like Noël Mercier, that Gregory was putting himself in danger by going there?
Of course, all these casual meeting places, whether heterosexual or homosexual, are high-risk areas. First, they are high-risk because they are isolated, away from residential areas and with little surveillance. Second, because the people who go there to have sex with strangers could come across people with bad intentions, perverts or even maniacs. And finally, these places favor larceny, where thieves take advantage of the participants' delicate situation to steal their wallets or personal belongings, knowing full well that it won't be reported.
In your opinion, could Gregory Mercier have been the victim of a homophobic crime?
Of course, it has all the trappings of one. Gregory could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He could have been chosen at random from all the men who were there.
But according to that theory, there would be no pre-existing link between Gregory Mercier and his killer.
Indeed, in a homophobic crime, a specific victim isn't the target. It's a man who is selected at random. He is violently beaten, sometimes to death. But here, the MO makes me think that it was Gregory himself who was the target. So I think this was not a homophobic crime.
Do you think that Gregory Mercier had arranged to meet his killer that night and fell into an ambush?
Not necessarily. Someone who resented Gregory Mercier knew they had every chance of finding him there, especially on a Saturday night.
Jean-Marc, we know that this place is frequented by many people. So the killer took a big risk by committing the act there.
Yes, but their hatred and desire to kill was stronger than the fear of being unmasked, not of being disarmed, because it's hard to imagine someone taking on a determined and armed man with their bare hands.
Annecy PD continue their investigations. They dig through Gregory Mercier's past in search of an event that could explain the murder. This is how they discover the story of an earlier assault. The incident took place in 1994, when Gregory was still a high school student. While returning home after class to Annemasse, he was robbed and hit by a neighbor of the same age.
This boy was known to the Annemasse police, particularly for various robberies, but he was also known for drugs. He abused drugs and alcohol. That's what he was known for.
At the time, Noël Mercier was a deputy sergeant with the Annemasse Police Department.
I was called out for a robbery, and then I realized that it was my son who had been assaulted, and his attacker had hit him and taken his wallet.
The former police officer remembers this case very well.
The individual who assaulted my son was arrested. He was taken to the police station. He was questioned. He was released 2 or 3 hours later.
But shortly after, a very unpleasant surprise was in store for Gregory.
2 weeks after the assault, we found an anonymous letter in our mailbox which said, "Revenge is a dish best served cold. Merci."
The attacker has always denied writing this threatening letter.
We did a handwriting comparison, and no further action was taken. Apparently, he wasn't the one who wrote the letter, so we couldn't take the investigation any further. It didn't lead anywhere.
In 1994, the young man who assaulted and robbed Gregory Mercier was sentenced to 4 months in prison. A very harsh sentence. Is it possible that this individual wanted revenge 17 years later?
I didn't believe for a moment that he could have hurt my son. He hurt him to steal his wallet, yes. That was his way. But from there to killing someone, I don't think so. No, it wasn't his usual way of acting.
On September 30th, 2011, 2 months after the murder, the man is brought into the Annemasse police station. He denies any involvement in the crime and offers a cast-iron alibi for the night of the murder. Like every Saturday, he was taking care of a severely disabled friend. He's totally in the clear. It's then that Noël Mercier tells the investigators that his son's meal tickets have disappeared.
My father contacted the investigators about the meal tickets that were in the satchel that wasn't found.
The manager of the place where my son worked told us the numbers, and we quickly passed them to the head of the investigation.
At the start of every month, we received 1 meal ticket per day. So since we worked 5 days a week for 4 weeks, we got around 20.
Killed on August 6, 2011, Gregory Mercier did not have time to spend them all. The police questioned the company that sells the meal tickets to find out if they've been used since the night of the murder.
On October 18th, Sodexo sends a message to the police saying that 6 tickets have been used in businesses near my son's workplace.
The meal tickets were used at the businesses where Gregory Mercier went every day. Could it be that the person who stole them from the crime scene knew Gregory?
The fact that they knew that the person they murdered could eat there with his meal tickets is pretty appalling. Maybe it's someone who came to the store often, who we knew. It sends shivers down your spine.
These 6 meal tickets were used between September 23rd and October 3rd, 2011, almost 2 months after the murder. The police have not been able to identify the person who used them.
They didn't even bother going downtown to warn the storekeepers that they were likely to receive stolen tickets. That could have made it possible to identify the person who stole the satchel or committed the murder.
Negar, it's clear that Noël Mercier, a retired police officer, is very invested in the investigation into his son's murder. He doesn't hesitate to phone the police about different leads, and he doesn't hold back from criticizing their work. What do you think of his behavior?
In principle, the investigation is secret so that the investigators can work in peace, and the parties only have access to the file through their lawyer. Our case is rather unique, since Gregory Mercier's father, who is the plaintiff, nevertheless keeps calling the investigators to participate directly in the investigation, instead of going through his lawyer. This behavior can be explained by the fact that Gregory Mercier's father is a former policeman who knows how investigations work. It can also be explained by his distress, but in principle, it's something that's not done.
We've just heard about the assault on Gregory Mercier in 1994, during which he was hit and had his wallet stolen. The perpetrator at the time was sentenced to 4 months in prison. What do you think of this harsh sentence?
Generally speaking, what can explain the severity of a sentence, apart from the seriousness or circumstances of the offense, is what's called the personality of the perpetrator. The police investigate the perpetrator, their background, their history, if it was an isolated incident or if they've had dealings with the police before, in which case the magistrates are obviously harsher on them. And in our case, Gregory Mercier's attacker was known to the authorities, since he had already been involved in theft and drug trafficking, and this is undoubtedly why the magistrates handed down a relatively harsh sentence.
The police continue to search the victim's life for an explanation for the crime. The personal lead is still at the center of the investigation, and more precisely, Gregory Mercier's romantic relationships.
Several doors are opened which shed light on the victim, his personality, and his social circle. When it comes to Gregory Mercier, his homosexuality could be a reason if he had a bad encounter or a bad relationship.
In the majority of murder cases, the perpetrator and the victim know each other. So, was it revenge? Was it a relationship issue between the killer and the victim?
Thanks to a spontaneous testimony from a stationery salesman who often came to the victim's workplace, the police find out an important piece of information.
My son had been threatened by a person who came to his workplace several times. He had told this to a salesman who came regularly and who he'd become friendly with.
Gregory Mercier had confided to the salesman that the person making the threats was one of his exes.
This man told him not to leave the matter as it was, and that he had to report him. Apparently, He didn't report him, unfortunately.
Gregory never spoke to his colleagues about these threats.
I didn't hear about these threats at all. He didn't confide in me. I think it was his dad who told me. I wasn't aware of it, and I admit that I was very surprised, because there was no one more lovable or more harmless than him. So it was pretty disturbing.
However, the young man confided to one of his friends, who today prefers to testify anonymously.
He never wanted to tell me the name. I asked him, "Who is it?" No. But he was harassing him on the phone and even at his workplace.
Thanks to analysis of Gregory's phone records, this man is eventually identified by the investigators. He had a brief romantic relationship with the victim. Gregory, finding him too possessive, was the one who decided to end their relationship, outright refusing to see his former lover again.
When he was little, he let people walk all over him. When he grew up, he let them do it less. He gained more confidence and strength of character.
Did this man kill Gregory as revenge for the breakup?
This rejected man couldn't stand Gregory's indifference when he said it was over. And this situation was unbearable for him.
Questioned by the Annecy police officers on December 18, 2011, 4.5 months after the murder, the man immediately offers a cast-iron alibi.
He was in the hospital, in the emergency room, so the investigators concluded that he had nothing to do with the murder.
The investigators continue exploring the romantic lead. They have known since the beginning of the case that Gregory was HIV positive. What if that had something to do with the murder?
The investigators continue their work and look into the possibility that a former partner or lover wanted revenge after learning that Gregory Mercier was HIV positive.
Of course, imagine if you had unprotected sex and you didn't know that your partner was HIV positive. Then you found out you were HIV positive. That's something to really be angry about. You might want revenge on the person who infected you. That's perfectly possible.
HIV has an impact, especially from a societal point of view. Some people have problems when it comes to their familial, social, and professional circles, so it has consequences.
But could these consequences really drive someone to murder?
Someone could go as far as murder, since they feel they have nothing to lose because their life is in danger. They could do something irredeemable.
Gregory Mercier's family then tells the police a very interesting piece of information. 3 years before the murder, the young man had a great love story that ended painfully overnight.
The breakup happened because they found out that Gregory was HIV positive and his partner didn't accept him. So they split up and he had to come back to live with his mother.
The guy told him, "I can't go on like this. I'm too scared. That's it. It's over."
Delphine Mercier admits today that she didn't like her brother's partner.
We didn't like him much. We respected the fact that Gregory was with him because he was his partner, but we weren't keen on the person himself.
The police bring in Gregory Mercier's ex-boyfriend. The latter assures them that he didn't know about the murder. There's no evidence to incriminate him, so this man is in the clear. But the lead of revenge for an infection isn't abandoned.
It's still a theory that needs to be worked on. We mustn't close this door.
For months, the investigation has been going nowhere, and Gregory Mercier's family is getting impatient. On September 16, 2011, almost a year after the murder, Gregory Mercier's loved ones organize a tribute march in en masse. An association in memory of the victim is created, and a call for witnesses is launched to gather information about the murder.
This collective, this association, and people who were very close to this association promised a reward of 10,000 euros to anyone with information that would make it possible to solve the case and arrest the person or people who committed the murder.
2 days after the tribute march, the victim's father receives a message on the Facebook page dedicated to his son's memory. A man reports that he witnessed, a few days before the murder, a disturbing scene at the place where Gregory was killed. He clearly remembers seeing a young man being pursued by 2 attackers.
He wasn't sure if it was my son, but a person who went to that place on the Thursday evening before the murder had been chased by 2 guys dressed like soldiers. They had tried to catch him, but the pursued individual managed to escape them and get in his car.
The witness is questioned by the investigators.
He said that it was my son who was targeted.
Personally, I was a bit skeptical. I thought, I don't see how Gregory, who wasn't someone who faced up to danger, would be chased by 2 men and then return 2 days later to the same place. But he was convinced it was him.
He told me, yes, it was him. He was the target of the attack.
Who were these 2 men who tried to attack Gregory Mercier?
Right away, I thought it was someone who had it in for him. It was someone who wanted to make him pay for something. So he sent 2 guys after him to give him a good beating.
The 2 attackers have never been identified. The police have followed several leads without managing to catch the culprit. Months pass and the investigation continues, but no single lead comes to the forefront. Almost a year and a half after the murder of Gregory Mercier, an unexpected twist revives the investigation. On December 24, 2012, the public prosecutor of Annecy receives a letter from a convict.
An allegation came from a penitentiary. It soon appeared to be a very serious allegation because it was corroborated, giving details which had not been published in the press.
The author of this letter claims that one of his fellow inmates is Gregory Mercier's killer. He describes hearing him use a phone in his cell to ask a friend a favor.
He asked them to hide the weapon and the vehicle that he had used on the day of the crime.
The informant remembers his co-prisoner saying that his car was a white Ford Courier.
We thought that the person making the allegation must have had one way or another precise knowledge of what happened.
The police officers investigate the individual accused by the allegation. They learn that this man is a violent repeat offender who is serving prison sentences for burglaries and robberies. His criminal record is marked by 14 convictions. The police discover that this man was free at the time of Gregory Mercier's murder. They decide on January 28, 2014, to place him in police custody. The man is collected from his cell and taken to the Annecy police station.
This person immediately says in the first interrogation that he knew the victim.
The suspect explains that he met Gregory Mercier at a bar in Annemasse. They allegedly went for drinks together several times.
He keeps saying that he had nothing to do with my son's murder, but he knew my son well. He had seen him several times, and he knows that he had a family member, a brother or a father, who was a police officer.
It seems that the suspect lived in Annemasse for a long time at his girlfriend's house. His profile as a repeat offender is of particular interest to the investigators, especially since he was convicted in 2009 for illegal firearms possession.
He liked guns, and apparently it was his hobby in a way.
The suspect acknowledges that he owned, at the time of Gregory Mercier's murder, a white Ford. But he firmly denies any involvement in the murder and can't explain the letter accusing him. His police custody ends after 5 hours and 50 minutes of interrogation. The man is then taken back to the penitentiary. 2 months later, the investigators decide to take his ex-girlfriend into custody, the person the man allegedly asked to get rid of the murder weapon.
She says very clearly that she has never been contacted by this individual to do him any favors. It's been a long time since she's had any contact with him, whether in person or over the phone. In any case, in her own words, she never would have agreed to get involved, directly or indirectly, in the concealment of evidence.
The young woman nevertheless confesses to the investigators that she knew about her lover's illegal activities.
This man is a criminal. I think he didn't hide it, since she knew that he regularly spent time in prison. However, when he got out of prison, he often came back to her and spent money, which she suspected probably came from the robberies he said he was committing, and she didn't want to know any more.
The young woman answers the police's questions.
She gives information about this man's lifestyle, the cars he drives, and the fact that at some point he had a gun in his car, which she had seen and wasn't particularly worried about. She tries to faithfully report all this information to the investigators.
No charges are brought against this young woman.
But finally, I think she understood that dating him could be serious. Even if you're not the one committing the crimes, you have to be careful about the people you spend time with. I think she became fully aware of that with these interviews.
The police continue their investigation and discover that the suspect knows the crime scene well.
He had already been convicted several times. He knows the places because he uses them as part of his criminal activities. So that's interesting.
It turns out that on the street in S03E03, the man hid his stolen goods and shared them with his accomplices. Is it possible that this individual killed Gregory Mercier for accidentally witnessing illegal trafficking? In November 2015, the suspect is indicted for the murder of Gregory Mercier. Before the examining magistrate, he denies any involvement in the murder.
He gave evidence suggesting that he could have an alibi, mentioning that he had booked a hotel room for at least 2 nights in the northeastern region of France.
The investigators cross-check the suspect's statements, but the alibi does not seem to be solid.
Maybe it's easy to say, I booked 2 nights in a hotel, as long as, for the time being, this isn't proven by sufficiently detailed testimonies, video surveillance, for example, or other evidence that would corroborate that, at the time of the murder, he was in the room he reserved. He reserved a room, but was the person actually there?
The police then discover a new clue. On the day of the murder, a withdrawal of €2 was made from the suspect's account in a post office branch near Caden-sur-Cannet in Moselle. But the office is unable to provide the investigators with the time the withdrawal was made. It's a shame, because with this information, the police could have determined for certain whether the suspect had time to go to the crime scene, more than 340 miles from Moselle.
The investigations must continue. A person was indicted and released after a short period of pre-trial detention. But for now, the investigations must continue in any way possible.
Nagar, the letter with the allegation reached the public prosecutor on December 24, 2012. The convict accused in this letter was taken into custody 13 months later. Why do you think it took more than a year for this man to be interrogated?
This question is difficult to answer. A judicial investigation is very long, and the pace is usually set by the examining magistrate to a certain extent, since there are some investigative measures that can be processed at the same time, while others depend on the results of previous investigations. In our case, the fact that the person accused in the letter was questioned a year later doesn't mean there were no investigations in the meantime. There must have been. We simply weren't aware. And it's undoubtedly thanks to these investigations and checks that the investigators eventually interrogated the accused person.
To be taken into custody, the man was taken from his cell to Annecy police station. Why wasn't he questioned directly in prison?
For several reasons. First, the very idea of police custody is that the suspect is for 48 hours kept in plain sight of the investigators at their police station and interrogated there several times according to the needs of the investigation. Secondly, the rights of the person in custody, including being examined by a doctor and assisted by a lawyer, would be much more difficult if the latter had to go to prison in the middle of the night. And finally, for reasons of confidentiality, the secrets of the investigation must be preserved. It would be much more difficult to do so if the custody took place at a prison among other inmates. So all these reasons justify the suspect being transferred to Annecy police station instead of the investigators going to his prison.
Today, this individual is still under investigation. This man has been waiting for more than 4 years to find out whether or not he will be sent before a court. Prosecution and defense investigations are ongoing. Since March 17, 2014, another lead has been at the center of the investigation.
We received a message from an individual who told me that what happened was related to my behavior, basically that I deserved it.
Here's the message received on the website in memory of Gregory Mercier. It's your fault that Gregory died by bad-mouthing people in bars and spouting crap to get people in trouble. It should have been you, asshole. The investigators wonder if Gregory Mercier was killed by someone who wanted revenge on his father, a former police officer.
I thought it could be related to me in the end. I'm a police officer. Haven't I had violent altercations in the past? And the person at the time may have threatened me and said, "You'll see, one day you'll pay for this. I'll take it out on your family." I've thought about that too. I thought maybe it could come from that.
Yes, it's possible. It's possible that someone went after the children of my uncle, who was a police officer for a long time in Annemasse. Yes, he was well known. People even knew I was his niece. Maybe, yes. Maybe it was revenge. It's conceivable. Anything is possible.
Our authority as police officers is often undermined. Often, people are not afraid of the police. People aren't afraid to tell them, "We know where you live and we're going to kill your children."
It isn't uncommon for police officers to receive threats.
Colleagues of mine have been threatened. Some have been forced to move, to leave their homes, because the threats were getting worse and worse. It was out of the question to put their families at risk.
By identifying the IP address of the computer that sent the message to Noël Mercier, the investigators managed to trace two suspects, two men who live in Lorient. And it so happens that Lorient was where Noël Mercier finished his career with the police before retiring.
These two people who were identified were questioned, but had nothing to do with the crime. These people did it because of the opinion they had of the Lorient Police Department.
So is it possible that Gregory Mercier was killed by someone who wanted revenge on his father?
I've been thinking about a lot of other people. People who were arrested sent threats to us, death threats. Often, "We're going to go after your son, your family, and everything." So I tried to remember, when it came to the documents I still had, the individuals I'd had the most problems with. There have been 2 or 3 names that have come back to me. People who would have been capable of this kind of thing.
At present, there's nothing to suggest that this is the right lead.
There has been no significant evidence to support the theory of retaliation or revenge. It's something to consider, but we don't have any evidence.
Jean-Marc, do you think this last lead is credible?
No. Although it is true that some police officers are victims of threats and fear for the safety of their families, fortunately these threats are almost never carried out. I can tell you that in nearly 40 years of service, neither the 2,000 or so employees with whom I worked, nor myself, have ever been the victim of revenge.
Today, the favored lead in this case is the repeat offender accused by his fellow inmate. This man who was indicted knew Gregory Mercier and regularly went to the crime scene to carry out his illegal activities. Jean-Marc, what do you think of this suspect?
Of course, we must always be wary of allegations made in prison. Very often, the informant has no other aim than to obtain favors from the justice system. But even so, in our case, there are several reasons to take it seriously. As you said, this suspect knew Gregory Mercier. He regularly went to the place where the crime was committed. What's more, he is described as someone violent, who likes guns. To top it off, he was free at the time of the incident, and his alibi strikes me as more than fragile. It even seems made up for the occasion. It's hard to explain the withdrawal of this small sum of €2 or this hotel reservation when no one recalls seeing him.
But why, in your opinion, would this man have killed Gregory Mercier?
It's possible that Gregory Mercier involuntarily witnessed this individual's illicit activities. This suspect would have been afraid of being recognized and maybe even reported, knowing that Gregory Mercier had a family member who worked in the police. But I want to clarify that this man still benefits from the presumption of innocence.
Jean-Marc, we know that on the evening of Gregory Mercier's murder, there were at least a dozen men present at the meeting place. Unfortunately, only one of them came forward, anonymously. Can we still hope to collect new testimonies today?
Yes, and probably more easily today than back then. At the time of the events, none of the men on the scene was keen on testifying, due to fear their sexual activity would be made public. In some cases, there are no witnesses, so there is no chance of getting information someday. But in this case, we know there are maybe a dozen witnesses, and this is fortunate for the investigation, because I think that over time, witnessing such a violent crime and keeping it a secret can become a burden, regardless of the circumstances in which it was witnessed.
It's terrible. I can tell you that every night I have nightmares. I go over the murder again and again.
My brother wanted to live, and he didn't get the chance. He died aged 34. We would like the murderer to be arrested and punished for what they did, because a crime deserves to be punished.
I think about him very often. I haven't forgotten him. And I also think a lot about the pain of his family. I'll do whatever it takes to stand by their side, because it's important to me for his killer to be finally arrested.
Personally, I can understand, in an unresolved legal case, the family's dissatisfaction, anger, distress, and sadness.
Today, the investigation into the murder of Gregory Mercier is ongoing.
Was it a homophobic crime? Was it revenge? Was it heartbreak?
The case is not closed. But if only they could finally take the bull by the horns and do something. That's what everyone is waiting for. In any case, the people close to Greg.
Everyone who knew Gregory Mercier remembers a kind young man. A young man whose main ambition was to be happy and to live in peace with his family and friends. His loved ones have been driven by anger, pain, and incomprehension since his murder. Their eagerness to get to the truth is matched only by the love they have for Gregory.